Thor is famous for being incredibly powerful. With his hammer Mjolnir and his belt of strength Utgard, he performed amazing feats of strength. But there was one time when he absolutely sucked. He couldn't finish his drink, he failed to pick up a cat, and he lost a wrestling match to an old woman. How did this happen? How did he get so rubbish? Well, it wasn't like in the Avengers where he got lazy and fat. This was Thor in his prime. There was something else going on which we'll discover in the tail of this video, and after that we'll see how he tried to redeem himself by going after the Midgard serpent Jormungandr. These are some of the most famous Norse myths, and they come from the Younger Edda, or the Prose Edda, written by Snorri Sturluson. The Prose Edda is one of two hugely important documents which tell us most of what we know about Norse mythology today, the other one being the Poetic Edda, which contains loads more stories. Our story today begins with Thor and Loki travelling to Utgard. Utgard is the outer world where dangerous giants and scary monsters live. On the way, they pick up a young man called Thialfi as a retainer. Thialfi is a mortal human who runs really fast. One night on their journey, they were looking for somewhere to sleep, and they found a very large hall with an entrance that took up the whole breadth of one of the ends of the building, and they decided to stay there. But at midnight, they were awakened by an earthquake. They were worried, so they went down one of the side passages of the hall, and Thor stood on guard, while the earthquakes continued groaning throughout the night. In the morning, they discovered that the source of the earthquakes was a huge giant nearby who had been sleeping and snoring. The great hall where Thor, Loki and Thialfi had spent the night was actually a massive glove which belonged to this giant. But fortunately, the giant wasn't dangerous. His name was Skrymir. And after a bit of conversation, they decided to put all of their provisions in Skrymir's bag so he could carry the load for them. And then they travelled all day towards Utgard before stopping for supper. Skrymir went straight to sleep, and Thor couldn't get into the provisions bag because the strings were tied too tight. As Thor tended to do, he got angry, and he tried to wake the giant by using his hammer Mjolnir to whack him on the head. The giant woke up and asked if a leaf had fallen on him. Then he went back to sleep. Again Thor swung, and again Skrymir woke, and this time asked if an acorn had hit him on the head. A third time Thor swung with all his might, and this time the giant simply asked if a bird had been perched above and knocked down a twig. Needless to say, Thor was quite annoyed. In the morning, Skrymir said he had to go, but he pointed them towards Utgard and warned them not to boast because the people of Utgard would not be impressed by that. Thor and Loki and Thialfi made their way to Utgard, a massive city with a gate so huge that Thor couldn't open it. Instead, they managed to slip through the gaps between the bars of the gate. It was that big. When they got in, they came to a hall full of prodigiously large people, chief amongst which was Utgard Loki, the king of this place. They greeted Utgard Loki, who responded by saying, "No one is permitted to remain here who does not, in some feat or other, excel all other men." In other words, each of them had to do something incredibly impressive to be allowed to stay. And of course, as proud people, they were not ones to back down from the challenge. And Loki was the first to volunteer. Loki was famous for being able to eat ridiculously fast, so he challenged anyone to an eating competition. Utgard Loki chose a giant called Logi to take on the challenge. Now, let's pause a moment and look at these names. We've got three that are very similar. First, we have Loki, who is the trickster god that we all know and love/hate. Second, we have Utgard Loki, who is the giant king of Utgard. And third, we have Logi, who is another giant and a guest at Utgard. So they set up the eating competition with a trough full of flesh. Loki at one end, Logi at the other, and they had to eat as fast as they could until they meet in the middle. Loki ate the flesh insanely fast, disturbingly fast, but when he got to the middle, he found that Loki had not only matched him in speed, but had also eaten all of the bones and the trough in which all of the flesh was placed. Loki was defeated. Then Thialfi said he could beat anyone in a running race. He was set against a young giant called Hugi. Thialfi was ridiculously fast for a mortal, but he got smashed by Hugi, who got to the finish line and nearly all the way back before Thialfi had just gone a few paces. Thialfi didn't want to give up easily, so they had two more races which Hugi won quite comfortably, but each time Thialfi did do a little bit better. But regardless, he had lost the challenge. And now it was Thor's turn. Confident to the point of arrogance, Thor was not going to back down. He said he would be up for a drinking challenge. Utgard Loki brought in a large drinking horn and said that a good drinker could drain it all in one draught, An okay drinker would get it in 2, but only the most puny drinker of all can do it in 3. Thor grabbed the horn and started drinking as much as he could. Thor was famous for drinking loads and loads and loads, but when he finally had to stop and looked at the level of the drink in the horn, it had only gone down by a tiny amount, almost impossible to see. Utgard Loki mocked him a little, so Thor took another draught and drained as much as he could. Again, it had only gone down a tiny amount. On the 3rd draft, Thor was quite angry because he was at the level of the most puny drinker, so he drank and drank and drank and drank. But again, the level of the liquor had only gone down a tiny amount. Utgard Loki was not impressed. But Thor wouldn't give up that easily and requested another challenge. So Utgard Loki suggested that he try the child's game of lifting up a cat. Obviously Thor thought that would be quite easy, so he immediately grabbed the cat and wrenched it upwards, but he couldn't lift it. In fact, after lots of straining and agonizing, he managed to lift up 1 foot. And that was it. As you can imagine, Thor was really not in a good mood by now, and he challenged anyone to a wrestling match, which he was confident he could win. And a toothless old woman, a nurse called Ellie, was brought out to face him. This didn't seem like much of a challenge, but Thor wanted to win, so he wrestled with her. He grappled with all his might and technique, but the tighter he held, the firmer she stood. And finally, Thor lost his footing and fell to his knee. He had failed. Again. He couldn't take a drink, he couldn't lift a cat, and he couldn't wrestle an old woman. It was a lesson in humility for Thor. He was ashamed, saying the next morning when they left the city, "You will call me a man of little worth." And that was when Utgard Loki told him the truth. It had all been a deception. Skrymir, the giant they had met on their journey, was actually Utgard Loki in disguise. When Thor hit his head with a hammer, it would have killed him, but Utgard Loki brought a rocky mountain in front of him which Thor could not see. The 3 colossal blows that Thor made with Mjolnir made massive valleys down the side of that mountain. But that wasn't the only illusion. Logi, the giant who had beaten Loki in the eating competition, was actually fire itself and had burned through all of the flesh and bone and trough. The young giant Hugi, who had destroyed the Alfie in the running race, was actually Thor. And it's impossible to run faster than Thor. Worse, when Thor drank from his horn, he was actually drinking from the sea, and he drained the sea considerably and caused the tides which last until this day. But what about the cat? That was actually the disguised Midgard serpent Jormungandr, who encircles the entire world. That Thor managed to lift up 1 leg was an incredible feat in itself. And finally, wrestling with the old woman was the greatest trick, because she was Ellie, old age. Nobody can fight against her, and the harder you try, the faster you fall. Utgard Loki was very worried by the power of Loki and Thor, and he was quite happy to get rid of them. Thor, as he tends to do, went into a rage, and he went to attack Utgard Loki, who had disappeared. And when they charged towards the city, that had also vanished. And so they were tricked and humiliated. But Thor had something else on his mind. Jormungandr, the Midgard serpent. And this is where we get to his fishing trip, which happens a little later. But before we start on that story, a little bit of context. Jormungandr is one of Loki's children, along with Fenrir and Hel. The gods are terrified of these 3 children because of their role in Ragnarok, when the gods will fall. In that epic battle, Thor and Jormungandr will fight each other and both be killed in that fight. So there's more than a little rivalry. So Thor went out searching for the Midgard serpent, hoping perhaps to redeem himself from the humiliation of Utgard Loki, and maybe trying to kill the beast before Ragnarok even happened. And now, so we can really enjoy this iconic story, I'm going to read directly from the Prose Edda by Snorri Sturluson, translated by Rasmus Bjorn Andersen. Thor was determined to make amends for the journey just spoken of, and he had not been long at home ere he set out again so hastily that he had neither his car nor his goats, nor any followers with him. He went out of Midgard under the semblance of a young man, and came at dusk to the dwelling of a giant called Heimir. Here Thor passed the night, but at the break of day, when he perceived that Heimir was making his boat ready for fishing, he arose and dressed himself, and begged the giant would let him row out to sea with him. Heimir answered that a puny stripling like he was could be of no great use to him. Besides, he added, "Thou wilt catch thy death of cold if I go so far out and remain so long as I am accustomed to do." Thor said that for all that, he would row as far from the land as Heimir had a mind, and was not sure which of them would be the first who might wish to row back again. At the same time, he was so enraged that he felt sorely inclined to let his mallet ring on the giant's skull without further delay, but intending to try his strength elsewhere, he stifled his wrath and asked Heimir what he meant to bait with. Heimir told him to look out for a bait himself. Thor instantly went up to a herd of oxen that belonged to the giant, and seizing the largest bull that bore the name of Himinbrjot, wrung off his head, and returning with it to the boat, put out to sea with Heimir. Thor rowed aft with 2 oars, and with such force that Heimir, who rowed at the prow, saw with surprise how swiftly the boat was driven forward. He then observed that they were come to the place where he was wont to angle for flatfish, but Thor assured him that they had better go on a good way further. They accordingly continued to ply their oars, until Heimir cried out that if they did not stop, they would be in danger from the great Midgard serpent. Notwithstanding this, Thor persisted in rowing further, and in spite of Heimir's remonstrances, was a great while before he would lay down his oars. He then took out a fishing line, extremely strong, furnished with an equally strong hook, on which he fixed the bull's head and cast his line into the sea. The bait soon reached the bottom, and it may be truly said that Thor then deceived the Midgard serpent not a whit less than Utgard Loki had deceived Thor when he obliged him to lift up the serpent in his hand, for the monster greedily caught at the bait, and the hook stuck fast in his palate. Stung with the pain, the serpent tugged at the hook so violently that Thor was obliged to hold fast with both hands by the pegs that bear against the oars. But his wrath now waxed high, and assuming all his divine power, he pulled so hard at the line that his feet forced their way through the boat and went down to the bottom of the sea, whilst with his hands he drew up the serpent to the side of the vessel. It is impossible to express by words the dreadful scene that now took place. Thor on the one hand darting looks of ire on the serpent, whilst the monster, rearing his head, spouted out floods of venom upon him. It is said that when the giant Heimir beheld the serpent, he turned pale and trembled with fright, and seeing moreover that the water was entering his boat on all sides, he took out his knife, just as Thor raised his mallet aloft, and cut the line, on which the serpent sunk again under the water. Thor, however, launched his mallet at him, and there are some who say that it struck off the monster's head at the bottom of the sea. But one may assert with more certainty that he still lives and lies in the ocean. Thor then struck Heimir such a blow with his fist nigh the ear that the giant fell headlong into the water, and Thor, wading with rapid strides, soon came to the land again. And there we have it, Thor's fishing trip after the Utgard Loki myth. If you enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate it if you hit the like button. Soon I'll be making a video on Jormungandr and other massive snake beings, so subscribe to make sure you don't miss that. See you next time!